Well, thank you for watching Morning Live. Now, as expected, the CR17 campaign funding matter featured rather prominently when President Cyril Ramaphosa appeared in the National Assembly yesterday. And he defended the campaign as saying that there was no wrongdoing or abuse of donor funds. The opposition, however, didn't seem convinced about this. Now, let's get some analysis on the matter. With me here in studio is political analyst Levy Ndou, and from our Port Elizabeth studio, we're joined by political analyst Ongama Mtimka. Thanks to both of you for coming through this morning. Ongama, let me start with you. We knew what was the feature of the Fifth Parliament. We knew that there was quite a bit of a robust disruption from the EFF. It was almost an expected feature. And perhaps before we just get into yesterday, let's just reflect on the optics and the nuances in the House for the Sixth Parliament.
Good morning, Sakina, and your viewers. So yesterday was a great victory for democracy in South Africa. In terms of the rapport and the relationships and the nuances thereof, I see a very interesting trend that the EFF has found a way to differ very robustly and frankly, in fact the entire opposition, to differ very robustly and frankly, but in ways that are easy enough to crack jokes, but also at the same time unrelenting in asking difficult questions from the president. I quite liked the collaboration, for example, around the question of asset prescription between the DA and the EFF, which got the president to repeat his answer. And I think it's a sign of great things that are going to come ahead in terms of the robustness of the debate in Parliament. But also what I saw is that the president is very careful not to fight, not to have a zero-sum approach to how he answers questions in Parliament. It's a win-win where, for example, he's being corrected by a member. He's quick to acknowledge, but also, point to some direction in future in terms of how there is a potential to correct things. Now, for me, this bodes very well for democracy because it shows that we have an executive and a legislative house that have got mutual respect, but are very much committed to frank debate.
Your view on that, Liv?
Indeed, there is a great shift from the Fifth administration to the Sixth administration. And I think it is mainly informed by the manner in which the president show up or relates to members of the opposition. You don't see that element of hostility amongst politicians. And I think it also sends a message, a clear message out there, that members of different political parties are not necessarily enemies. These are the people that are given a responsibility to run South Africa and make laws for all of us. And they don't have to do that whilst they portray an element of hatred and enmity. And that is what everybody has actually observed in the Sixth administration, that you have people that will bring different ideas to bring them all together so that at the end of the day, South Africa is to move forward. And also, you would always hear the president saying, I would love to work together with all political parties in order to address all the challenges. He does not necessarily only mention his party as the one that is given the mandate to govern. He actually gives the opportunity to all political parties to add their views, to show South Africa that this is not the South Africa of the ANC, it's the South Africa of all political parties and all that are represented in Parliament.
And we saw that severally yesterday, whereby he invited members from various parties, inviting them after the fact to come and sit with him, joining on certain ventures in order to prove certain points to them. But I want to move on from that, getting into some of the details around the questions yesterday. And firstly, Ongama, your thoughts on the president's answers, and in the interest of time, you can actually choose which parts of those answers you want to focus on.
Sure. In the broadest sense, Sakina, the president went to Parliament to take control of the debate, and I think he did well in doing so. But Parliament didn't lose in the process. So on the question of political party funding, he gave a very apt answer First of all, one about whether or not there was corruption and wrongdoing in his campaign funding and handling of the funds. And obviously the court is going to pronounce on that. Or in fact, the NPA, once it apprises itself of the details, is going to pronounce on that. But the one thing that he did very well was to take what has so far been a taboo, the issue of internal contestation, and make it to be, it's actually expected to happen in a democracy. And also in venturing into the realm of the legislation when it comes to governing and the vacuum that is there when it comes to internal party funding. Because our legislation currently, both the past act and the current one, talk generally about funded parties and how they should be conducting election funding. But it is silent on internal party campaigns. So I found that the president was able to answer that question quite correctly. On the question, lastly, of the asset prescription, I think, Sakina, there's a very philosophical issue that we need to deal with as South Africans. If we borrow from international markets, we are robbing future generations on the basis of the mistakes that have been committed by the current generation. If we take from our pensions, however, we are robbing ourselves relatively. We're putting ourselves in a position where we are robbing ourselves, but the future generation will be thankful because they will not inherit international debt, which they must forgo internal policy making and take the dictates of foreign capital. Because as the law says, whoever, the borrower is a servant to the lender, and that is always the case. So it's important that as we think through this idea of asset prescription, we're mindful of the fact that if in fact we are the one, we leverage domestic savings, we are helping the country and to retain its sovereignty rather than running to the IMF. So I think that question was handled quite well also.
And Levy, if you could perhaps factor into your response, if you want to reflect on that issue as well, the potential, policy tool that could be used here, but we do have precedents in this instance, and there have been experiences in the past, and how will this serve us going forward?
Indeed. What I liked about the president is that, as expected by the entire South African population, is that everybody expected the opposition parties to go very hard on the president. And I think what he did was to say, let me go there and utilize this opportunity to be very open and make sure that after this session, everybody has a clear understanding of what has actually happened, and also proposed that Parliament must come up with a framework that relates to party funding. And I think the president also listened to the clip by Vuyani that said that the opposition is going to grill him in Parliament, and what he did was to actually bring onto the picture everybody else, even the most ignorant people, to know how the funding has actually happened, but also, importantly, what does not exist in South Africa is the framework for political party funding. But one other area that for me was a highlight was the acknowledgement by the president that the issue of job creation as outlined in the NDP has actually not yielded results as expected. And it is the very same president who said, these are the issues that we cannot do, or I cannot do alone. I would need to get regular meetings with NEDLEC, and is actually going to have another summit that has to deal with the issue of job creation. And if we all concerned about job creation, we need to start saying this is a challenge as all political parties, and actually make our best in making proposals to the government so that we take this as our own problem, and then we should also solve it together.
And there was something, I guess, comforting in the president acknowledging those shortcomings of the NDP, or at least the failure to deliver the results that we expected in an expeditious manner. But there was also something very disconcerting in listening to the president acknowledge that this country doesn't have money, Ongama Mtimka.
That was a shocker, but also what we know by now. There's been talk of borrowing money from elsewhere. So perhaps that's what we didn't want to hear. And you know, Sakina, every time we come to get details about the extent of how dire the situation is, we almost get pushed into expecting a magic wand. And what the president alluded to in terms of the response was that it is sticking to the mundane. It is committing to the sectoral interventions in the textile sectors and the other sectors that were highlighted, and doing what we know, which will take us out of the current crisis. But talking about the admissions that the president made, I quite liked how when Musi dropped the 3 million thank you letter bombshell, that the president showed that there is value in the fights in the institutions or that protect our democracy. Because now, if you noticed, his response was, I'm going to take Kwebane's counsel, and I'm not going to rush to an answer. And that's an important nuance. And had it not been for the crisis the president has been putting around the 500,000 investigation, he would not have gotten to that level. And I think that he did that deliberately also to show that he's a constitutionalist that values the role that is played by Chapter 9 institutions, even at a time when he's fighting with that office.
And just finally, the SOEs, and once again talking about stabilizing Eskom, and we know Eskom is the biggest threat, the single biggest threat to our country when it comes to debt and leveraging on what these SOEs could possibly do for this country but are not doing. So talking about that and prescribed assets, do we know what we're doing? And I've asked this question so many times. Do we know how to stabilize Eskom and all the other SOEs along with it?
One of the biggest challenges of the sixth administration is to ensure that the SOEs actually deliver on their mandate, which has been a challenge for the past many, many years. There are issues that relate to SAA, there are issues that relate to Eskom. And whether we like it or not, for South Africa to be prosperous, we need Eskom to deliver on its mandate. And there might be different approaches that might be utilized. But what we need to do is to come up with the best approach to ensure that Eskom is to deliver its mandate as expected. There has been issues that relate to the abuse of resources at Eskom. There has been issues that relate to leadership. And those are the critical areas that will expect the minister to actually start touching on to ensure that Eskom is able to deliver on its mandate. But another aspect for me is that I think we need a mind shift, especially at Eskom. There is an element of demoralization, and especially among staff. And that is one critical area that government and the department has to focus on. But for me, if we need South Africa to move forward, Eskom is one area that is very critical, that will require sufficient improvement so that we actually get the best results.
But still, does government know what to do with Eskom? At the moment, Eskom being such a critical component to this country, to economic growth, to sovereign debt, and you can go on listing why Eskom is such an important entity. And yet, here you have an entity that is a black hole. Money, literally, if you put money into Eskom, you could as well just be burning it. Ongama, where is the solution to Eskom? And I think, beyond the rhetoric, beyond we think, where is the solution? Because it is dire at this point that we find that solution.
In fact, Eskom is so risky it could plunge the whole country into a crisis. Here's my impatience with how the politicians are handling Eskom and SOE's Sakina, is the failure to commit to timelines for the turnaround and make demands on leadership that are unrelenting and managing consequence. You shouldn't have in a state-owned enterprise the kind of mistake that is costly as Medupi and Kusile. And the fact that it has taken us this much time to find a workable solution around those, and we aren't seeing any mega lawsuits against the international companies as well as their local allies. Like, when it comes to recovering, money is lost there. In fact, it just baffles my mind why in the contracting we didn't build in hefty penalties for failure to deliver working infrastructure there when the risk or the capital expenditure has been that huge. So one thing for me needs to be done, Sakina, there. The management needs to be given very clear instructions in terms of a turnaround. The resources must be availed, but timelines are important. And when there's no compliance with those timelines, people must be just fired. We can't continue to have to accept mediocrity as a country in an important asset like that one.
Well, I wish we had more time, gentlemen, but we don't. But thank you so much for your reflections on yesterday's interactions in the National Assembly. Political analyst Levy Ndou, and from our Port Elizabeth studios, political analyst Ongama Mtimka, helping us to unpack President Cyril Ramaphosa's responses to Parliament yesterday. Let's take a break. On the other